First up, Bloomberg's Adrian Wooldridge writes this week's cover story about the death of meritocracy. A new progressive aristocracy is taking over Britain and America, he says. To explain, he joins me now alongside journalist Peter Hitchens. Adrian, Peter, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. Adrian, you write the cover for this week's magazine where you look at a new kind of attack on meritocracy. What do you say?
I say essentially this, that in the pre-modern world, we had a society which was hierarchical and in which people were judged according to their membership of groups rather than their individual abilities. So if you're a woman or if you're a member of the lower classes, you were ipso facto subordinate. And we had since then, since about the middle of the 19th century, a bit before that, we had a liberal revolution which said, no, you must judge people as individuals rather than as members of groups, and you should promote them according to their individual merits rather than their group identities. And the most fulfilling version of that was the idea of meritocracy. And I think for a long time, we had this idea of meritocracy broadening and deepening. And particularly after the Second World War, we had a sort of period in which meritocracy was in many ways the ruling ideology of the world. Then we had the left, which had done a great deal to promote meritocracy, turning against the idea of meritocracy, saying that it perverted socialism from an ideal of equality to one of competition, and that you should get rid of these awful institutions like the 11 plus and grammar schools. That anti-meritocratic revolution happened, but it began to run out of steam a bit. Mrs. Thatcher pushed back against it by saying that we need meritocracy, but the ideal vehicle of meritocracy is the market rather than the state. And Tony Blair, to some extent, New Labour pushed back against it by accepting league tables and academic schools. But now what we have is another big push against meritocracy. This time it's being done in the name of woke rather than in the name of equality, comprehensive schools, egalitarianism. But it's much more serious this time than it was last time because it presents an alternative hierarchy to the world. And that hierarchy is a hierarchy of virtue rather than the hierarchy of equality. And what this hierarchy does is to reinvent the pre-modern world in some ways, to say that we should judge people on the basis of their group identities. This is the right way to be looking at the world, but we must invert the old pyramid, that oppressed groups should be judged to be virtuous in the way that the old ruling class was judged to be virtuous, and that we must get rid of this idea of judging people on individual merits, because it's a deceit, it's a lie, it's a way of perpetuating privilege. So this is once a sort of more vigorous attack on meritocracy and an assertion of a different way of organizing the world according to virtue, as conceived by the woke elite, rather than individual merit. In other words, it's the most significant attack we've seen on the liberal idea, I think, in my lifetime.
Peter, let's break down this concept of meritocracy a little bit. It's quite popular to say these days that meritocracy doesn't really exist, that hard work doesn't get you anywhere. What do you make of the concept of meritocracy? Do you think one exists in the UK?
I'm not sure a concept existed, but I think a fact has probably always existed. Naturally, any intelligent society tends towards a certain amount of meritocracy. Any society which ignores the existence of talent in its midst and doesn't bring it on and make the maximum use of it is a foolish society. And I think there are a lot of occasions during our history when we have overcome snobbery and all kinds of other barriers and said to people they should be promoted on their merits. I'm not sure the left, by the way, was trying to attack meritocracy when it attacked grammar schools, particularly. Michael Young's book on the rise of the meritocracy was his own quirky view that meritocracy would lead to some kind of hideous society where people resented the justice of the position they found themselves in. I don't think most people ever felt that. The left foolishly believed that by opening up certificates to everybody, they opened up the knowledge that ought to go with them to everybody. And so we have a society of huge numbers of certificates and very little knowledge, which is probably not what they intended, but it is what they got.
Adrian, can you talk us through how you think this latest wave started and why you think it's arguably more intense than previous waves?
Well, it started in American academia in many ways in the 1990s with the development of critical race theory and new waves of feminism. And the unique thing about these ideas is that they started off with the belief that judging people as individuals and embracing the idea of meritocracy is a delusion. Because individuals are caught up in a web of relations which are more important than their individual qualities, and because society is structurally unjust. So the only way to get about this is not to give in to this bourgeois ideal of meritocracy, but to look at these structural problems and overcome them through group, collective action rather than individual action. So it was a university idea that very strangely has permeated the whole of society, and particularly it's made this strange transition from quite radical university departments, or in some ways what seemed like quite marginal university departments, to the heart of the corporation through human resource departments. And human resource, most corporations now, particularly in the United States, but spreading right across the world, are committed to something called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this word equity is an extraordinarily powerful word because it says that what we should be aiming at in business is not equality of opportunity, which is the old meritocratic ideal, but in some ways of equality of results. And some strange people believe in the equality of results, but it's a very radical reinterpretation of what society should be about. And one of the strangest things that's happened is that a lot of radicals have come to the conclusion that the best way to pursue their ends is not by overturning capitalism, but by transforming capitalism from within, capturing things like human resource departments and working within corporations to define their ends in very new ways.
Peter, Adrian mentions academics there and university campuses where he thinks has started to bubble up. In his piece, he talks about Cambridge academic Priyamvada Gopal, who has said things like abolish whiteness. What do you make of this? I mean, should we really be too worried about some rogue comments that are said from academics on university campuses?
Well, it does seem to spread quite quickly out of universities, doesn't it? So we should worry about it because it obviously has an appeal. I think the appeal that it has is the one which Adrian mentioned at the beginning, the appeal of virtue. That we live in a society where the old concepts of virtue, which were based on Christianity, have more or less died away. It's not known or understood as a religion or as a set of principles or as a moral system by millions of people who find themselves even so craving, as I think almost everybody does, for some sort of guidance as to how to be good. And here we have a whole new set of beliefs which provides a set of guidance in how to be good. And it's unrecognizable and mysterious to me because I grew up in a different one, but I think we have to understand that fundamentally, it's however much damage it does, it's born on the wings of a desire which most of us can understand as reasonable. The problem is, it's wrong that they have not got it right. They've become obsessed with climate change. They've become obsessed with sexual politics, and they've also become obsessed. And this, I think, is the result of a definite campaign rather than collapse of the Christian religion. They've become obsessed with getting rid of the patriarchy and of actually making a profound and final attack on what we used to view as the family. I think the real sufferer in all this is the family, and the real gainer in the end will be the state. But as with so many disastrous developments in modern civilization, it's based on a benevolent wish, but unfortunately the benevolent wish will not turn out to be as benevolent in practice as it was in theory.
And Adrian, in your cover piece, you add another element to this, and you say it's one of the biggest aspects of this new attack on meritocracy, and that, of course, is race. What do you think has changed in our conversations in the West about race over these past few years?
I think what's happened with this version of woke that we now have is that race has become much more central. They've sort of thrown race into the very center of these things. And they've added to throwing race into the center of these things a sort of deceit, because the notion is that the problems, the very real problems of racial inequality, can only be solved through collective action and through the identification of people with their racial identity rather than with any other sort of identity. I would say that within the meritocratic framework, we had already taken very significant steps towards removing barriers to ethnic minorities from being successful. In this country, we have many members of ethnic minorities in the cabinet, many members of ethnic minorities doing extremely well at school. Perhaps the most successful school in the country is the Brampton Manor Academy in East London. So we were, through meritocracy, addressing long-term inequalities of opportunity. But what the woke do is to say that that's an impossibility. You can't do that, that meritocracy is inherently racist. It's saturated with racism. And the only way to overcome injustice is not to look at individual ability or individual effort, but to have collective categories, collective struggles, and a collective focus on these hidden forces of racism, which are everywhere in society. So they have, as it were, they've come in at a time when people have never been freer, certainly in advanced countries, of racial bias, prejudice, and said, no, you're wrong, you're not free, you're absolutely, all of these things are very deeply involved in what you think, what you do in society, and it's only through a process of collective action, doing the work, that we can solve these problems.
Peter, one of the things I found really interesting about Adrian's cover piece is that he doesn't let the right off the hook. He talks about the right's own assault on meritocracy, calling it the form of populist rage rather than high Tory worry about social mobility. What do you make of that? Do you think the right is just as complicit in this attack?
Well, there isn't really a right-left, is there? There are people who consider themselves to be on the right who are in many cases just market liberals who have no real social theory at all, who've long ago left behind the precepts of Christianity, who aren't socially or morally particularly conservative, and who are happy for society to be extremely relaxed on those matters. And so they haven't really got an argument. Half the problem with the supposed right in this country is that it has long ago accepted or failed to challenge and therefore come to live with the things which the left have been demanding, particularly in the areas of sexual politics and of the strength and importance of the married family. They've just given in. They have nothing particular to say except let's have more markets. Let's have more free trade. How is this any kind of answer to the enormous, if slightly confused and in some cases bizarre, moral array of the new left which we face? You're
describing the classical wing of the Tory party, which I would argue has really actually dwindled over the years, but that's one wing. Of course, there's another wing, which I think Adrian is referring to, although he can jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, which does have that more populist take. Actually, they might be more economically liberal, more socially conservative, but crucially are quite happy to engage in the culture wars.
Well, I don't see much trace of it, honestly. I don't think that the occasional Jordan Peterson outburst makes much difference to the enormous preponderance of the other point of view, particularly on campuses, or has really much of an answer to it. If you didn't fight, as the conservative parties of the Western nations did not fight, the cultural and moral wars of the 1950s and 1960s, you haven't got much left to say when we arrive at this stage, because you've given in over so many of the earlier battles that you really have no position from which to stand. I think there's a realization which I think everybody who's on the conservative side of society needs to make, that we've lost, and that there's very little chance of getting anything back. And that is probably the only realistic position to take. But the reasons why we lost lie in battles long ago. I would say that really and truly, if you wanted to combat these developments, you needed to combat them back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the other side were thinking very hard about them indeed. People like Roy Jenkins and Anthony Croston to begin with, and then after that, the theorists who brought us to what became called political correctness. A huge revolution in the way we behaved and organised our society, which the supposed right had no answer to except more market.
Adrian, it's interesting to me in your piece that you say that the Conservatives essentially should feel shame for the rise of the woke aristocracy under their control. I mean, in this country, they have been in power for well over a decade.
Absolutely, I would say about the populist right. I think the populist right is a very significant force, primarily in the United States, with this sort of Jacksonian tradition that is embodied by Trump, and that's a populist sentiment which is really against elites of various sorts, but particularly against the sort of the pointy-headed elites of universities and bureaucracies. And we see elements of that in the Conservative party here. That the Nadine Dorries talking about posh boys who don't know the price of milk and all the rest of it. They're saying that these people are out of touch with the common people and their great common sense, and that they're somehow deluded people. I think Brexit was a manifestation of that sort of populist anger. Again, Trump, obviously so. I think in the question of the fight against wokery and the laziness of the Conservative Party, I think wokery is the wrong answer to some real questions. The real questions are, why are certain groups in this country trapped in poverty? Why do other groups continue to dominate society and continue to get an unfair share of the rewards of that society? And I think there are certain answers to that question which can be delivered by looking at the meritocratic tradition and modifying it, improving it for the modern world. I think the Brampton Manor Academy, various academically selective schools that try and reach out to poorer people are examples of that. But we haven't pushed far enough on that. We've talked about levelling up, but we haven't talked anything like enough about spreading excellence throughout the country and increasing opportunities about the country. And so woke has risen, partly, as Peter has said, as a way of slaking our appetite for virtue, but partly as incorrect solutions to very, very real problems. And I think that we have to try harder, not only to address these problems, but to, almost to crow that we are addressing them, or we will have the workers doing what I think they're doing, which is to smuggle in a pre-modern way of thinking about the world into modernity, a pre-liberal way of looking at the world, which I think is profoundly unhelpful.
Peter and Adrian, thanks for joining me.